Let's just take a moment and consider God's presence with us here this evening. Heavenly Father, thank you for the meal that we had earlier. Thank you for such a good turnout of the students tonight. We just ask that you open our hearts and our minds to whatever it is that you want us to learn tonight. We ask that you send Blessed Pier Giorgio Frassati to be with us tonight so that he can help impart important parts of his life to me and also inspire the students to learn from the lessons that he might be able to teach us. We ask this through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. This is from Matthew chapter 5, verses 3 to 12. He began to teach them, saying, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are they who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the land. Blessed are they who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be satisfied. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. Blessed are the clean of heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Blessed are they who are persecuted for the sake of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when they insult you and persecute you and utter every kind of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward will be great in heaven." The gospel of the Lord. So as I mentioned, we're talking tonight about Blessed Pier Giorgio Frassati. I didn't say saint because he has not been canonized yet, but I think it's only a matter of time. He's a contemporary saint, so he lived within the last 100 years. And so I think sometimes it's a little easier to relate to them. The other thing about him is that he was a pretty young guy when he died. And so there's some things in his life that I think could be very applicable to you guys, that you might be able to take a lesson from him. He was born in April of 1901, and he was born in Italy, and his parents were pretty rich. His father owned a newspaper, and the last name Frassati is actually one of the three most important names in Italy even today. But he owned this newspaper called La Stampa, and it was a pretty widespread newspaper at the time. And so he made a lot of money. His dad was also an ambassador to Germany from Italy, so he was pretty important politically as well. But his father was an atheist. His mother was Catholic, but she went to mass, but they never saw her receive communion. He had a grandmother and a grandfather who were still alive when he was born. Excuse me. And his grandmother, though, spent a lot of her time just kind of praying in her room, which, like the speaker that I listened to said, a lot of older Italian women do that, just to pray for their dead as they age. But Pierre was born, he was the second child. His older sister died in infancy. Excuse me. And then he had one other younger sister who lived quite a bit longer. But even from a young age, Pierre exhibited signs that he kind of understood what was going on with faith, and it's really incredible because he wasn't brought up in a Catholic family. Like I said, there was nothing at home that would even indicate that they were a Catholic family. Like the mother she went to church, but she didn't even receive communion. So not even sure why she went, other than out of some sort of sense of obligation. But even from a very young age, there's a couple of stories when he was 4 years old that we're told that was like, he got it at 4 years old. So for instance, they had this one tutor who happened to be a nun. And they were walking down the street one day, and the nun saw that there was a priest coming. And in those days, when the priest was bringing viaticum or communion to a dying person, they would process with candle bearers, like altar servers, through the streets. And the nun said, here comes the priest, and he's bringing Jesus. We need to kneel because he's a king. And little Pierre, he said, yes, we must kneel because he is the King of Kings. And he said this at 4 years old, totally unchurched. And so he understood it. There was another story of him with his grandfather. His grandfather was giving a big donation to an orphanage. And little Pierre at 4 years old saw this one kid eating all by himself. And so he went over there to be with them. Now this kid, they had kind of segregated because he had a skin disease. They didn't want anybody else near him. But they saw Pierre over there, and they just kind of watched him, and he says, well, if no one else is going to sit here, I'll sit with you. In fact, let's share food. And he took the spoon, and he said, one for me, one for you, one for me, one for you. And he just sort of, he just had this very empathic heart from a very young age. And so, for whatever reason, he was really drawn to the Catholic faith. And maybe it was through the influence of his grandmother, maybe it was through the influence of this tutor, who was a nun. But it wasn't long. I mean, he was older than 4 years old. But when he was like in late, like 7, 8, 9, 10 years old, he started going to Mass. And nobody was taking him to Mass. He just found a way to go. And, this family, they were very rich. Like their smallest house, it said, had 36 rooms. Okay, the little house had that much. But they would go and they would have their vacation homes. And when they were on vacation, there was this monastery up in the mountains. Well, Pierre would have the gardener wake him up. He had a string tied to the bed, tied to the nightstand, and it would go out the window. And the gardener, when he came in very early in the morning, would pull the string and it would shake the nightstand. Pierre would wake up, he'd sneak out, he'd go up to Mass, and he would run up this mountain. And there was the speaker that I was listening to said that when he made the hike, he said it took him 3 hours. Pierre did it in 45 minutes. He would literally run up the mountain, go to Mass, come home, say his rosary while kneeling alongside his bed, and then go back to bed. And sometimes he would fall asleep on the floor while saying his rosary, and his father just thought, well, he just fell out of bed. But anyway, he did this for a lot of years. There was one time, though, when the gardener shook the nightstand and Pierre didn't wake up, and he kept shaking the nightstand, and the nightstand tipped over. And it made a loud noise in the house, and the family kind of wondered what was going on, but he was able to cover that up. But as he grew up, as he was in his mid-teens and late teens, he was just a very charismatic guy. And so there was a lot of people that hang out with him. He had a lot of friends. He would do lots of things. He had a lot of money, and maybe some of them were hanging out with him because he had money. But certainly there weren't a lot of poor people hanging out, just for the money either. However, he was actually spending a lot of time with the poor. So he would get an allowance, and he would take that, and he would go and he would buy all the day-old bread, and he would take it out to the poor. He's doing this as a teenager, you guys' age. Okay, and his father, bought him a car. Again, he buys him a car, and it's like 17, 19, 18. And so, cars aren't as plentiful then. Car was kind of a luxury at that point in time. He went out and sold it, and he got the money, and he would just take his bike or he would run to wherever he was going. But he took the money from the sale of the car, and he started buying things for poor people, for everything from groceries to helping them with their medicines, to helping them with their bills and their rent. They said by the time he was around 20 years old, he was caring for 125 families and all their needs, just by doing it. But it wasn't like he was out there going, hey, I'm Pier Giorgio Frassati. He knew that his name was very well known. And so since he was studying to be a third order Dominican, he just took the name Brother Jerome. So when they asked who he was, he'd say, I'm Brother Jerome. So they didn't know who specifically he was. And so this is what he did. He wasn't out there I'm gonna do all these good deeds so I can win all sorts of favor. He just did it because he saw a need. And so he started filling that need. Like I said, he was friends with lots of other teens, lots of people in their early 20s, and they partied a lot, but they never saw him drink more than one glass of wine with a meal. His other friends were drinking and carrying on and making a lot of loud noises and things like that. And he would make loud, jokes and laugh really loudly with them, but he was never drunk. He said he never uttered a curse word. He never told a bad joke, right? He just was, but everybody was just drawn to this guy. And so what he would do is they would go to the pool hall, and he would bet them, and he would say, look, if you win, I'll pay you money. If I win, we're all going to go to the holy hour up at the church when we're all done here. And he would just annihilate everybody in pool. And so then all these people would have to go to the holy hour. And so they'd go, kind of running through the streets and pushing and shoving and laughing and giggling. But as soon as he entered the church, it's like his demeanor changed. And again, it wasn't that he was doing bad stuff. He was just kind of the life of the party, just having fun with his friends. He was just a regular guy. He wasn't engaging in all the other stuff, all the drinking and the bad jokes and all that kind of stuff. But he was with them, and he was having fun. So as soon as he got into the church, he would always carry like these rosaries and these pamphlets, and he would hand them out to his friends. And they would go around, they'd sit around the church, and he'd go right up to like the communion rail. And again, this is a bigger, older church, and so there was much more ornate, lots of candles lit, and they would go up to the midnight holy hour, and he would just be lost in prayer for like an hour. They said one time he was just so lost in prayer, he was kneeling, and the priest saw that there was this candle that was up there that was dripping. So he went up to change it, and the wax was dripping on his arm, and he was totally unfazed by this. He was so wrapped in prayer, it didn't even affect him. And then when that hour was over, he just knew it, and he just get up, and then they would take off, and they'd go walking and making noise and laughing down the street and like that. But his friends knew that, that this was a part of who he was. And so they took vacations, and he always made sure that he was able to get a priest to come along so they could say mass, or that they were going, if they were in an area where there was going to be a church, that there was going to be availability for mass. And if there wasn't, he wouldn't go on the trip. He always made sure that they were going to be able to do mass, and he was going to daily mass as well. But the people that were with him, they were just, they knew it, but they didn't know it at the same time because he was just a regular guy. So he was doing his thing, and they were okay with that. They know it. They knew it was having an influence on them, but they didn't. I don't think they realized it until later on how much of an influence he actually had on them. And so he spent a lot of time, continuing to take care of poor families. But he was still living at home. He was at one point he said, I'm thinking about being a priest. And his mother said to him, she said, I'd rather see you dead than be a priest. So she had this real disdain for the church, even though she was going to church. She just didn't see that as something that her son. I think both the parents thought that things like that were beneath him, because they were kind of this upper class family. And so one time he brought a girl home, and to kind of get approval from the parents, and both of them kind of said, no, she's not well off enough for you, and so they kind of shunned her as well. And so he just was he wasn't struggling to find his vocation, but he really wasn't feeling called to marriage or the priesthood. He was just kind of discerning things. And so he decided that he really wanted to work with people who needed like the face of Christ in their lives. So he decided he was going to get a degree in engineering and in mining, because what he wanted to do is go work with the people in the mines so that he could kind of, not preach, but he could kind of evangelize them. And he knew that they were kind of a forgotten people. And he thought he might do this in some of the mines in Europe, or that he might go to the United States was kind of one of his goals, and to help some of the immigrants over there to evangelize them. And so he was working on his degree, but he was also the member of so many societies like the Confraternity of the Rosary and St. Vincent de Paul, and he was a Third Order Dominican, and there was a whole list of other things that he was a very active member, a very part of all Catholic organizations. But again, like I said, he was still living at home, and as time wore on, his mother and his father had grown apart, and they announced at dinner one night that they were going to get a divorce. And this is at a time like in the early 1920s when divorce was not a common thing, not like today certainly. And so this was a real scandal. I mean, this really affected him in a big way. And he soon after that, he told a friend, he said, I would give my very life if my parents would stay together. And so he kept doing what he was doing, helping the poor. And eventually what happened was he was visiting a man that had polio. And Pierre contracted the polio from this young man. And so he wound up getting the polio. And this is at a time when there was no vaccination for polio, no cure for it. And so he started getting sicker and sicker, but he never complained about it. In fact, the only reason that one of the servants knew that he was sick is because he asked for an aspirin. And polio is a very debilitating disease. It's very painful, and eventually there's paralysis that goes along with this. And he's asking for an aspirin. And this is at a time, right around this time, his grandmother died. And so this kind of took the attention towards everybody coming to the house and visiting. In these days, they would visit the house to view the body. And so people were coming to the house. And so he was able to kind of conceal the fact that he was not feeling well. But nobody even noticed the fact that he was stumbling down the hallway to get to see his grandmother, that she was ill. And or that his grandmother who had died. They did not realize that he was ill. And then suddenly they did realize that he was ill after everything had died down from his grandmother's death. And they realized what it was, and they were trying to get, there were some experimental medications that they were trying to get from France. But this was in July, and there was a freak snowstorm in the mountains. They couldn't get a plane over the mountains. Again, 1925, not too many planes like now, right? They couldn't get this plane over the mountains to go get the experimental drugs. And so so the night before he died, he called his sister into his room, and he said, I need you to go over to my jacket. There's a note in there I need you to get out. And there was a prescription in there, and he wanted to write a note. And she said, let me write the note. He says, no, I need to take care of this. And it said, this is the medication for the poor man named Converso. Please make sure he gets these injections. And so he wrote this instruction. So even when he's literally on his deathbed, he's more worried about the people that he was taking care of. And at this point, I think it was up to like 150 families he was taking care of. And so the next day, on July 4th of 1925, he dies. And, so the family starts preparing for this, and they announce his funeral. And they were just floored because they knew he had a lot of friends. But they said 10,000 people showed up to his funeral. And a lot of poor people that he'd been taking care of, and all these people from all walks of life. And the mother and the father, they were so taken aback by this that their relationship started to rebond, and they actually stayed together in their marriage. So his little prophecy that I would give my very life if my parents would stay together kind of came true at that point in time. So they buried him. His cause for canonization, after 5 years, you can have your cause introduced. And his parents started working on this. I mean, they started becoming more Catholic. They started working on getting his cause for canonization. But in Italy, so this is about 1930 in Italy, what's going on in Italy at the time? Okay. So Mussolini's there, and so the fascists are rising to power. And when he was alive, they were also rising to power. And there was actually a story of him at his house where the fascists came in and they were going to start confiscating stuff, and he beat them up, and he drove them off. Like 3 or 4 people. He defended the house, right? And this is the type of guy he was, very passionate, but he had his priorities in the right order. So defending your house is a totally legitimate thing to do. But at that point, the fascists started commandeering all of his father's assets. They realized that his father was against fascism, so they basically took his newspaper from him, and so he wasn't able to do it, and gave it to another family. They started confiscating their assets, and they were also affecting the Catholic Church. They said to the church, you can't put this guy up for sainthood, because they didn't want any heroes. They were trying to tear everybody's just the way they felt about themselves. They were trying to kind of break everybody down. And so his cause for canonization was delayed for a very long time. Finally, in the 1960s, Pope Paul VI comes along, late 1960s, and he was one of the people, he was in the youth group that Pier Giorgio Frassati had started. The Pope Paul VI was when he was a kid. I don't think they were friends, but I mean, that youth group had gone on, and he was part of that youth group. It's possible, I suppose, that he could have actually been in the youth group based on their age, but I couldn't find that out for sure. And so there had already been reports of miracles, and so Pope Paul VI asked the cardinals to get the paperwork in order for this. And after a time, he's like, where's the paperwork? Because they we haven't started it yet. And he's like, bring me the paperwork, I'm going to do this. So Pope Paul VI prepared all the paperwork for the canonization process to move forward with Pier Giorgio. And so eventually he got that stuff squared away. And I want to say he was beatified, I think it was in 1970, but I can't see my sheet. And that was definitely during the pontificate. No, I take that back. He got it started, but he was beatified in 1990 by John Paul II. But everything had been started by Pope Paul VI. And at his beatification mass, Pope John Paul II he called him the man of the Beatitudes. And that's what I read to you at the beginning, blessed are the poor, or blessed are the peacemakers. He said this man exemplified the Beatitudes. And so he coined that phrase that Pier Giorgio Frassati was the man of the Beatitudes. So he really lived this out. And so his cause for canonization goes on. There's still reports of miracles, but for whatever reason, it's just not progressing. when they exhumed his body in 1970, around the time of when they started the cause for canonization, they expected, just to find a decomposed body. But when they opened the casket, they said that his body was completely incorrupt. They said his skin was still soft, his eyes were open and they were shining. And eyes, I guess, are like one of the first things to decompose, but he was like totally incorrupt. But they said other things in the casket had decomposed, like his rosary, all but the crucifix was decomposed, and that was rusty. And so they knew the elements had gotten in there, but his body was still intact. And so that's why we don't have any bodily relics of him, because he's completely intact. There are some second and third class relics of him, but when the body is incorrupt, they typically do not take relics out because they're not going to start cutting into the body. Yeah. But there's again, incorruptibility is not necessarily, that's not like, oh, it's automatic that he's a saint. It doesn't hurt. It kind of says that there is some degree of sanctity with him. It's an interesting phenomena. And he was even more incorrupt than a lot of the incorruptibles that have been reported over time. So I would encourage you guys to get to know him, because, again, like we've talked about with other saints, when they die young, they didn't just like all of a sudden go, oh, I'm dying, I better become a saint, right? Like I said, this kid was from 4 years old, he kind of got it. And so when he was your age, he was doing, granted, he had money, but I think even if he didn't have money, he would have been doing what he could, because that's the person he was. And so the fact that he was, if you will, powered by the Eucharist, that he was going to Mass, he was adoring the Lord in the Eucharist, and he just did what he felt called to do. He would make that next right choice. He would see a need and he would fulfill it. And so, just that attitude of heart that he had, I think, is really important for us to take away from here, because all of us are capable of doing those things. So when those of you who've been confirmed and those of you that are preparing for confirmation, we ask you to do service. Again, it's not so we can go, okay, let's get some work done in the parish, we'll have these slaves do some work for us. That's not what this is. This is for us to go out and serve, so that we can go out and see, like we talked about Mother Teresa, we can go out and see Christ in others. And if you've ever been on Love Begins Here, that's what some of the students will talk about. They'll talk about, I saw God today in this person that we work for, because they were so grateful that we came and helped them. And so, again, I would encourage you to do that. They talk about Pier Giorgio Frassati at that, as well as Mother Teresa. But get to know him. There's a really good talk about him on Formed, which I know pretty much all of you have accounts with now, because you had to do stuff for confirmation. There's a couple of other things on YouTube about him. Father Gregory Pine, part of Pints of Aquinas, he does a couple of talks on him. And one of them was just posted 4 days ago. So there's some really good stuff about him. I would encourage you to learn about him. In the sheet that's here, there's a lot of pictures of the guy, and you can just see him. He's just a regular guy. He was a mountain climber. He was a skier. He just was an active guy. There's pictures of him smoking a pipe, smoking a cigar. He was just a regular guy. It wasn't like he wasn't like a monk in a habit praying 23 hours a day. So it shows that sainthood is achievable to all of us. And so don't buy the lie that becoming a saint is only for the very holy people. All of us are called to sainthood. Each and every one of us is called to be a saint. And that may seem like a really hard thing to do, but I think if you just take that thing that I mentioned, make the next right choice, that's the step. That's the pathway to sainthood. Do you guys have any questions? Uh-huh. Yeah, he's like got that huge smile on his face. The other thing that was really curious, they said, is he was a really terrible singer. But he would go in the back of the church and he would just sing as loudly as he could. And when they would be on the bus and they passed the church, they said he would start singing. And his friends would be like, will you shut up? You got a terrible voice. But he would just sing, to praise God. And so it was just interesting. It wasn't like he was doing it to be obnoxious. He was just doing it because he couldn't help but sing. So, yeah, I encourage you to look at these pictures. There's another one of him in the middle right, on the right side page. It's kind of a small picture, and he's another one where he's just belly laughing. He's just got a huge smile on his face, and he's laughing like crazy. So anyway, definitely someone that I think you guys can identify with. Maybe you don't have millions of dollars, but I think all of you have the spirit of him within you to go out and do the types of things that he did. We're in the joyful mysteries, and the mystery that we're studying now is the Nativity of the Lord, and the grace of that mystery is poverty of spirit. And so Pier Giorgio Frassati definitely was one who exhibited a poverty of spirit. He had a lot of wealth, and certainly when you're trying to provide for people, that makes it easier. But think about Mother Teresa, who we talked about last time. She had no wealth, and yet she went out with the same spirit that he had. Okay, so that poverty, they both of them had poverty of spirit, which is really important because when they go out, they're not doing it for themselves. Some of the stuff that they saw, I didn't talk too much about the things that Pierre saw, but I'm sure he saw a lot of squalor. I mean, he was in Turin, Italy, and there's rich areas and there's poor areas. And so if he was helping the poor people, some people would say, how can you go to their houses? And he'd be like, I go to Christ in the Eucharist and he comes to me, so I go out in to see the poor to go back and see him. And so that idea that he's not doing it to get any thrill, right? He's doing it because he sees the need and he wants to fill it. And I think if all of us look around in our community, we could probably all see a need that we can help fill, right? It may be different for every person. It could be anything, right? It doesn't have to be just helping the food pantry and just helping, this, that, and the other thing. It could be something that maybe nobody else recognizes. It could be helping out a kid at school who just feels lonely. That's seeing Christ in another person, and maybe it wouldn't be popular for you to go say something to that kid, but you do it anyway, right? Regardless of what it may mean to your reputation, that's the right thing to do. And that's what Pierre did. He would do the right thing. It didn't matter to him whether people were like, and at this time again in Italy, they were starting to come beat up priests, and they were starting to, call people out for being Catholic. And he's like, I don't care. Yeah, bring it. It was kind of how he was. And so, so he just keep doing that next right thing, and that's what he did. And so he just went out and he did what he knew he had to do. And again, it was because, like I said earlier, he was powered by the Eucharist. And so Christ inspires us to do things. So we can go out and do good works, and that's good and fine. We can do good works that are disconnected from our faith. That's okay. But when we do them connected with our faith, or do it out of love of Christ and do what we feel he's calling us to do, it's amplified. And so there's even greater grace in that. And the suffering that we see in other people can become redemptive. And there's all sorts of benefits to that. And so that's why we need to be like Pierre and stay tethered to our faith. And then our works will have true value. And that's kind of what we need to do. Okay? And I've seen plenty of students, after they get confirmed, like, I'm just going to go off, I'm going to do service. I don't need to come back and learn any more about my faith. I don't need to go to church anymore. I don't need to do any of that. There's not a lot of benefit in that. I mean, yes, they might be helping and doing good things, but we need to do good things as part of our Catholic community as well. That's what we're called to do. Okay, we're called to go deeper in our faith. We're called to continue, coming back to the Eucharist. We're called, to do it through Christ, because He will direct us on what to do. And we said that about Mother Teresa, right? They said with her one day, they had an hour of adoration every day, and the sisters one day said, "Yeah, we're really busy today. I don't think we're gonna have time for an hour of adoration." And she said, "You're right. So we're gonna do 2 hours today," because she knew that their focus needed to be on Christ in order to be as effective, to be able to do the things with joy that they were doing. And Pier Giorgio was the same exact way. He could do what he did, not because he felt good about it, but because he knew that this is what Christ wanted him to do. And in a way, it kind of gave him superhuman ability to deal with the poor in situations like the man had polio. And I'm sure there's other people that were sick and they were living in squalor, and he just went in and did it. He didn't worry about, ooh, this place smells, or this person, they don't look so good, or they're missing an arm, or whatever. He didn't worry about all that. He just did what he needed to do. And that's what we're called to do, that as individuals, that heroic virtue. That's what we're all called to do. So just remember that poverty of spirit, and that's a supernatural grace. That does not come just by us willing it. And so that's why if we're doing our good works apart from the faith, we may not have that true poverty of spirit that allows us to really take what we want to do and do great things with it.